I think all of us here are here for the truth. But to have truth, you have to have trust. And at this point, no, not any one party or any one group, trust has been broken. I think we all can agree that trust has been broken. And when we hear things like the board has investigated the situation, you have concluded that there was no fault, there is no trust in that result anymore.
Welcome to the Church Dropout podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. The clip you just watched was a segment from a 2-hour or 2+ hour town hall meeting at Fellowship Monrovia in Southern California, where Pastor Albert Tate and board members confronted a deeply troubling narrative concerning the church's leadership and internal operations. And after watching that entire video, it's clear that the culture at Fellowship Monrovia is toxic. It was very toxic. And after watching the video, what became clear also is that it's been that way for some time. And what's unfortunate is most of the people seemed blindsided and unaware of the toxic culture that existed in the church that they go to each Sunday. So what I want to do in this video, that's sort of based off of that video and the things that were a result of the conversations and the thoughts and the answers and all of that type stuff that was in that video, is share with you signs of a toxic church culture. And in specific, I want to give you 10 signs that you're toxic, that your church culture is toxic. As I said before, most people don't know that the culture is toxic because they're sitting in it, right? And I, to be honest with you, being a part of multiple communities, leading them as well as being a part of them, I didn't know that there were certain areas that were toxic and these behaviors were happening. So I want to give you 10 signs that your church culture may be toxic, kind of using the video in the backdrop. Now, I won't be revisiting the video in this podcast episode that I'm doing today. If you want, you can go to Julie Royce, her YouTube channel or her website. Shout out to Julie Royce, who reported on it. And then also she posted the video that I watched. Now I will or may refer back to portions of the video as an example, not showing it, but just speaking to it. So if you want context for those particular comments, then you'd have to go watch the video, but we're not going to review it here because I don't want this to be super long. And this is just a greater problem that I think exists within the church, right? There's a ton of churches that have toxic culture, and many people don't even know it. And so let's talk about it. So to begin with, what characterizes a toxic culture? A toxic culture is characterized by practices, policies, and leadership styles that promote or conceal unhealthy behaviors, conflicts, and power dynamics within the church community. This is a church culture issue, right? It's a church culture issue. And that's important because all churches are susceptible to toxicity within the culture. So it doesn't matter if a church has solid doctrine. It doesn't matter if a church has impeccable hermeneutics. It doesn't matter if the preaching is solid. You can still have a toxic culture, even having the gospel correct. And we've seen that in the past. I mean, go listen to the rise and the fall of Mars Hill. You'll see that, you can have a solid understanding of the gospel and community, yet still have a very toxic culture. So what are the signs of a toxic church? And by the way, I'm going to do a separate video on what are the signs of a toxic leader. But right now we're going to talk about a toxic church culture. So number one, secrecy, right? If you're in a church and there's a high level of secrecy, that's a toxic community, right? It creates an environment of mistrust and suspicion, and it hinders open communication and transparency. If there's a lack of transparency in that community, then you're probably in a toxic culture, right? And this leads to all kind of stuff. When I was looking at the video of Fellowship Monrovia, there were rumors that were happening, misinformation, and the leadership was trying to address that, telling people not to believe it. But the reality is that because they hid some of the things that were out there and did not get in front of it, it left people to think what they wanted to think about what actually happened. And so a culture of secrecy breeds rumors, it breeds mistrust, right? People are left to make decisions on their own. It's one thing if people are going to believe what they want to believe, even when the truth has been presented. But it's another thing when the truth is hidden and then people form an opinion and then you try to clean it up on the background. So secrecy is a huge part of toxic culture. Number 2, blind loyalty. Anytime a culture is pushing the body to be loyal blindly, that is a toxic culture. Demanding blind loyalty without question can result in an environment where critical thinking and healthy skepticism are discouraged, right? Potentially leading to unchecked abuse, power, and manipulation. Now, this, it sounds like, most people would say, that's not me, right? Like nobody can really control me. I'm not going to blindly follow people, but this is common in most churches, right? That people pedestal their leaders in a way that they don't question, right? And, they don't challenge. And, for me, this was very common, in the churches that I had fellowship with and where you don't question the leader, you follow, you know what I mean? And any sign of questioning is being disloyal and you find yourself outside the circle. So if you're part of a church and there's a sense of blind loyalty that needs to happen in order for you to be a part of that fellowship or to enjoy the results of being a part of that fellowship, then that's probably a toxic community. Number 3, conflicts and infighting. Now, it's normal for churches to have conflict, right? People are imperfect. We're going to have conflict in churches. But if there is constant conflict and infighting, then it's probably a toxic culture, right? It's being bred by how the culture actually conducts itself, that people feel like they need to engage in this type of behavior, right? Persistent conflicts and infighting within the church community can be signs of a toxic environment, undermining the unity and well-being of the congregation. Think about this. When Christ died for his church, the main thing was to bring all things into unity with himself, right? We find unity in Christ. And so when there's conflict in the body, we're actually working against what the gospel does in terms of making us one. And if a community is constantly infighting and there is conflict continually, then the culture is probably toxic. Number 4, it's all about the church. It's all about the church. And I know that sounds weird, but the reality is a toxic culture is going to sacrifice the church members on the altar of the church. And by church, I mean whatever that is, the building, the gathering, the greater community. In a toxic community, it's all about the institution moving forward, which I think is a part of a toxic church. And I think I may have written that down. Oh, that's next. But anyway, when it's all about the church and the church is prioritized over the interests and the well-being of the members of the church and the broader community, it's toxic. And that could lead to a self-centered, insular culture that neglects the needs of those that it's meant to serve. I've seen this a ton, right? Where, and let me back up a little bit. When I was planting a church, we had individuals that had come from other churches. And as we were trying to push missional intentionality, not just evangelism, we were saying, hey, listen, it's our job really to love the people around us, to give them the gospel, right? Not just in word, but in deed. There was a tendency for people to want to have ministries that feed themselves, right? So where's the men's ministry? Where's all of these various ministry types? Because the church wanted to prioritize its own needs over the well-being of the broader community, right? And if we would have kept going down that road, we would have become toxic because the church would have become insular and we would not have been fulfilling what Christ calls us to do, right? Which is to love and serve one another and to share the gospel with others. And so If the church is promoting, it's all about the church. And if people are being sacrificed on the altar of the well-being of the church, then that's a toxic culture. Number 5, the church as an institution. And, there's so many problems with this. Prioritizing the church as an institution over the spiritual mission is a problem. The church is not an institution, it's an organism. The church is not an institution, it's an organism. It's living, right? With Christ at the head. The Holy Spirit is involved with the church and directs the church and moves with the church. It's not an institution, it's not a business. And I actually heard this in the video and it was heartbreaking. They were like, hey, this is not only a church, but this is a business. And we have an HR department and we have, we have to run it like a business. We're sworn to secrecy in certain areas. And it was like, wow, right? The church's identity was split, right? Here you're in one sense, you're trying to use biblical principles to guide the people in this difficult time, but you can't because it's also functioning like an institution. Now, I'm not saying that means that we need to share everything. I'm just saying that when we think about the church as an institution, and opposed to the church being an organism with Christ at its head, and when we think of it that way, it actually, really breeds a toxic culture. Like this is why, especially in larger churches, and most people don't see this as a result of a toxic culture. If Christ says that one of the main goals of the body of Christ is to serve one another, and churches have a difficult time, especially large churches have a really difficult time to get people to engage in service, right? Because the way the culture is shaped is like a corporation, which means that you pay people to do ministry. And so people feel like if they're not paid, they don't have to do ministry. That breeds a toxic culture where people don't feel like they need to fulfill what Christ has called them to do because we have paid individuals that do it. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't be paid. What I am saying is that we got to be careful that we're not creating cultures that actually pull people or push people away from the call of Christ and create cultures that help to engage what Christ has called us to do. So prioritizing the church as an institution over an organism, a spiritual environment. If you hear that within your church, that this is a business, the way it's being ran is a business, that's a sign of a toxic culture. Number 6, personality worship. If there's elevating a leader or specific individuals and their status to almost idolization, that's a problem. And this is really common in the Black church. We tend to pedestal pastors a lot. Like the pastors are the center of the congregation life. And it's really, personality worship. And that pastor is the driving force of the community. Their personality is wrapped into the culture of the community, and people end up glorifying that personality. And if you're in a church where the pastor is being glorified, then that's a toxic culture. Now, I'm not saying the Bible says that we ought to honor our leaders, right? Like that's what the scripture says. We ought to treat them right. But the reality is that, we're not to idolize them or pedestal them in a way that puts them in a position where they can do no wrong or where their personality is glorified within the community. If there's a pastor or pastors within a specific community and they're being served in a way that we would serve Christ, that's a toxic culture. Number 7, different levels of accountability. If you exist in a church where there are various levels of accountability that don't necessarily pertain to the leadership community, then that's a toxic environment, right? If there's different rules for you than there is for the leaders, that's a toxic environment. In this particular specific situation, the pastor, Albert Tate, had a situation that happened and they decided not to tell the church or the staff. It didn't happen within the church, but it was something that he needed to step away and get some restoration for, but they decided not to tell the church. The interesting thing is I'm sure that there were situations within that community that happened, or situations with members within that community that may have had situations that may have been similar, but theirs was not treated the same way, right? It wasn't privatized as a matter or anything like that. Now I'm just making assumptions based upon what people are upset about. And so whenever there's a different leadership structure for the pastors, that's a sign of a toxic church. And one thing that we generally do, and we have to stop doing this as a church, we believe the ends justify the means, basically meaning that we sacrifice important parts of gospel ministry, not only to others, but to the person themselves, because we figure the mission is more important, right? The end result, the goal is more important. So again, we sacrifice people on the altar of the church or mission, and God cares way more about you than he cares about what you're doing for him, right? And so, we have to kind of dispel this myth of different levels of accountability. If you're in a church and the accountability structure only applies to the body, but not to the leadership, that's the sign of a toxic church. Number 8, sin management or legalism, right? Sin management, legalism. If there's an overemphasis on sin management or legalistic practices, this can create an environment where members are burdened with guilt, shame, detracting from the message of grace, love, and forgiveness. If you're in an environment and it's not grace led and it's led by legalism, if the emphasis is on your performance as a Christian, but not your growth, or it's not based on the fruit of the Spirit being exhibited in your life, but it's based upon your last behavior, you're only good as your last sin, then honestly, that's a toxic culture, right? If there's an overemphasis on sin management, right, on how we manage our sin, and if there's legalism where you have a lot of people who are pointing out everything that's going wrong or questioning people's salvation left and right, are they saved? All of this type stuff, that's a sin. I'm not saying, that's a toxic culture. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be concerned with those things, right? But there's a way that we can do that healthily and walk in a fellowship with people. And to be honest with you, the way we change, and this is just a bonus here, but the way we change is not by looking at our sin. That's not how we change. That's not how we're transformed. We're transformed by what we behold. So if we're looking at our sin, we just become better at not sinning, right? But if we're looking at Jesus, then we become better worshipers. And if you're looking at Jesus, then you will not, by natural reaction, stop sinning, right? Because you're in the presence of goodness. And so we need to change our focus. We're not walking into the kingdom backwards, right? Which some people are. They're walking into the kingdom backwards, and opposed to looking at Jesus, they're looking back at their sins, and they're not experiencing the grace and the goodness of Christ. So if you're in a community and sin management is at the helm, it's very legalistic, they're calling out sin left and right, that is the heart of that community. I'm not talking about people not wanting to be holy. I'm talking about an obsessive culture with sin management. Then that is a toxic environment. Number 9, doctrinal purity. Doctrinal purity. An obsessive focus on doctrinal purity at the expense of grace, love, and compassion can lead to a legalistic, judgmental culture. So this kind of plays in line with the last one, but the reality is, it's like when there is an emphasis on getting everything right, that we're going to have certainty in all of these areas, and there's no room for doubt, for questioning, there's no room for difference in belief, then that's a toxic environment. I remember when I was going to a church, or we were thinking about joining a community, and we didn't hold to their form of doctrine. And I remember having a conversation with the lead pastor and saying, hey, at that time, I was like, hey, I don't, get down with this form of, or with this theological perspective. I have gifts that I want to be able to operate within the body, over time. And, will that hinder, our relationship or my family's ability to participate in gospel community here? And that leader was like, hey, listen, there may be certain areas that we can't, because we believe doctrine drives the culture. Didn't say it in an unhealthy way, but he said that doctrine drives the culture, and but we have no problem with you believing differently than we believe. And we went to that church, and in fact, actually became a pastor on staff, and still, really close friends, like super close friends with the lead, with the same pastor. But again, over time, our relationship developed and grew, and we don't hold that stuff tightly, right? We have different beliefs in some areas. We may believe things differently, but we can still do ministry and walk together. In fact, they were a part of the community that helped launch us out when we felt like it was time for us to, do our own thing in ministry. But if you're in a church where they're pushing for doctrinal purity in a way that's unhealthy, and it's really choking out any diversity of thought in the community, then that's a toxic culture. And lastly, number 10, low to no accountability structure for leadership, right? Low to no accountability structure for leadership. Again, this is similar to a different accountability structure for the community. But if there is no accountability structure for leaders in terms of like, there's not other individuals that can speak very plainly and clearly and authoritatively in the life of the pastor, I would even say within that community. And this is ongoing. A community may not start that way, but a community cannot live that way. If there's nobody that has the authority to speak to the pastor or speak over the pastor, then that's probably a sign that this is a toxic church, right? Because nobody is above reproach. I mean, nobody is above, what word am I looking for? Correction. You understand what I'm saying? And so a pastor should not sit outside the community. He should not sit outside the community for his own spiritual well-being, right? But also for times like this, where the pastor needs to demonstrate how he thrives within that community, or how they're shaping the community, right? And so if there's no leadership there, no plurality of elders there, and that's not within the plans. The plan is to have one pastor be at the head and nobody else to help keep that person accountable. Then that's a sign of a toxic church. And I'll also say this: it's not good enough just to have other individuals in leadership. It's not good just to have elders. If they are elders but they have no authority, then they're not biblical elders, right? Like they're not functioning. If they cannot set the pastor down or speak authoritatively into the pastor's life, if the pastor still has authority over them in a way that they cannot speak, then that's a problem. I'll give you an example looking at, Fellowship Monrovia. So if some of the elders in that community were on staff, that means the pastor would manage them, right? But that's a conflict of power. How can you manage someone who also needs to be able to exercise authority over you, right? So now their job is tied to their position. And see, and this is where, when we look at the church as an institution, these things don't generally work, right? Because these things become a natural conflict, right? So how can you keep someone accountable that you have no power? How can you keep someone accountable when they have all the power over you? You understand what I'm saying? And so it's not just good enough to have elders. If those elders are not empowered and authoritative and can speak freely, if the pastor's running unchecked with leaders that are there, then that's a sign that community is toxic, and there's no real leadership structure that's there to support and to rule out any issues that may come up in the future. And when I listened to this, and if you decide to listen to it, you'll hear that the first thing that they say at the beginning is that the structure didn't support. The structure that they had allowed for all of these things to take place. Their words, right? Because they didn't have the proper structure. They were saying because of the size of the church and how the church was growing, they didn't put bylaws in place, all of these separate things. And because they didn't do all of these things, that enabled these negative experiences, sins, whatever it may be, to be pervasive in the community, and also allowed the pastor to function in a way that may have been unhealthy and unwise within that community. So if you're part of a church and there's low to no accountability structure for leadership, there's nobody who has the authority to speak into the leadership community. If you can't, even have a word with your pastor about something that you see or that you're experiencing, and they get offended by that and they don't listen to that, that's a problem. That's a sign that the leadership culture is toxic. That's it. So those are the 10 reasons that I have, or the 10 signs rather, of a toxic church. Like I said before, I will do something on 10 signs of a toxic leader, maybe 10. I don't know. There's so many more. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So if there's something that you want to add to this, I'd appreciate it. Drop it in the comments below. Please like, rate, and subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast at. And that's it for today. Thank you so much. God bless you.